Today's guest is Ben Carey, an Australian composer, improviser, and educator based in Sydney, Eora. He makes electronic music using the modular synthesizer, develops interactive music software, and creates audiovisual works. He is a senior lecturer in composition and music technology at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, University of Sydney, and his research and practice is concerned with interactive and generative music. My name is Giovanni Grandi, and this is Let's Talk Music with Frap Tools. Thank you very much, Ben, for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. Nice to see you again.
I always start by asking our guests what their musical journey has been, and what fascinates me the most is how and why they approach the modular synthesizer, because most of the time it's not like the first instrument they come to. And so I'm also curious to hear why they ended up with the modular synthesizer.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the question is how far we go back. Yeah. I mean, look, I started, music's always been in my family. I started playing, my first instrument was guitar. I've got a twin brother, and we both identical twin brother, and we both played music from really young. So we played classical guitar. My dad was a bit of a frustrated guitarist, and before stopping playing, he had started learning classical guitar. So it was kind of inevitable that his children would start learning classical guitar. But my main instrument is actually saxophone. So I started playing saxophone when I was about 9 because I wanted that kind of social element of being in a band. So we had like a wind band, I guess, at our primary school. So I started playing the saxophone. My mother was a music teacher at a high school, and she had 2 instruments left in the cupboard at her high school. One was a saxophone, one was a clarinet, and she gave one to me and one to my brother Nick, and that's kind of how that started. So I played saxophone. I did lots of wind bands, and the saxophone study that I did was classical saxophone. So I don't have a background in jazz, although I would have played in stage bands and things like that. Classical saxophone, and then later on kind of classical contemporary saxophone is what I did. I did that all the way through high school. I did an undergraduate in that, and then I went over to Bordeaux in France and studied for 2 years doing contemporary chamber music and saxophone performance. So my instrumental background is really tied up with playing the saxophone, being a wind player, interpreting new music. Was playing in sax quartets. We used to do things like Xenakis and played Donatoni, and was really interested in a lot of that kind of contemporary classical stuff. So electronic music came much later. I started, before I moved to France, I started tinkering around with software. And so I started playing around with first Pure Data and then Max MSP. I was really interested in improvisation at that time, finding ways of using my saxophone, my instrument, in ways that were uncommon. I'd seen John Butcher, this amazing saxophone player, do a live set in Sydney, and I'd heard a bunch of his recordings where he'd used feedback with his instruments. So really kind of putting the saxophone bell into the microphone and inducing feedback and stuff. And there was a bit of a scene going on in Sydney at that time with improvised music, improvised live electronic stuff. And I thought, oh, this is kind of cool. Maybe I can do something like that. So as I was studying the more hardcore contemporary classical stuff, I started experimenting on the side. And then I built up some pretty decent skills in Max MSP, and I developed a lot of kind of interactive software. That's where I ended up I did my PhD in that side of things, improvising with instruments and what it actually means to be someone who's building software at the same time as kind of improvising and interpreting, getting on stage and being surprised by an instrument that you've designed, and that was like a real conceptual interest at that time for me. So I think during that period, so by the time I was, it was maybe 2010, 2011, when I was in the early stages of my PhD, I started getting interested in a bit of analog gear here and there. I didn't have any background in synthesizers really. It was really just instrumental work and then software. And so I kind of have gone in a way from the digital to the analog. And I don't think it's it's a pretty it's a pretty standard thing, I think, these days for people to move from software to hardware. And so, yeah, and then I got a Moog Mother and a little 3U skiff, and then started getting into modular synthesis, and now it's kind of my main compositional and performance tool. So I'm interested in lots of different things to do with its performability, and also just the kind of generative side of things, and that links, I think, a lot to my background in working with Macs and kind of designing software. Saxophone hasn't come out of its case for a while though, so.
Well, I think that it is pretty common to transition from digital to analog. But especially considering how powerful computers have become nowadays, so it's fairly easy to get a very performance-oriented computer machine as opposed to even just 10 or 15 years ago. But I don't think that is that common to transition from low-level programming to ready-made instruments. So I would like to expand on this topic, because most of the time it goes the other way around. So you start with an instrument that someone else made, like a synthesizer, even digital synthesizer like Serum or Massive. And then as you find the limitation, you start going deeper and deeper. So this is rather slightly uncommon, I would say.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it like that before. I mean, I guess, so when I was, finishing off my undergrad studies in saxophone, I had a lot of friends that were composers, and those composers had talked about this program called Max and what it was capable of. They were all like going through this particular course together and were finding it really challenging, but I kind of asked them questions about what it was capable of, and it seemed like it could be something that would be interesting to work with live electronics. And I was at that time like massively into like really avant-garde contemporary classical music, and electronics. Things for instrument electronics were a big part of that world, although I was pretty ignorant about what was possible. So I had it in the back of my mind, and having gone to live gigs, improvised gigs, and seeing people doing a very DIY aesthetic, where they've got a couple of tools, or they might be working with feedback or amplifying balloons or something and spatializing them, that kind of stuff, and thinking, oh, actually, I don't necessarily need to know all the low-level stuff. I can start playing myself. Was where I really kind of got into it. And the coding side of things, I guess, came because I then knew that for me, in my mind, the next step was what I'd already was aware of, which was my friends who'd done Max. So I was kind of, I did a bit of deep diving into that. But yeah, I think that coming from Max to modular was an interesting one. I mean, I first thought when I started getting into analog synths, the Moog Mother was the thing that I chose to start with, and it had all these patch points. And I kind of researched. I thought, it'd be great to be able to use my Mo2 interface and send out DC coupled stuff. And I was already interested in working with kind of complex signal generation in Max, and how could I computer control analog gear. And yeah, it was just a testing ground for that. And then quite soon after getting that, I realized how fun it was just being away from the computer. Like all of us do, right? Like it's a way of thinking, and thinking about how much I could get out of this thing that was fixed, although it was extensible and was open, and you could do a bunch of stuff with it. And then, the modular journey was building up bit by bit, but there was something really nice about just kind of being focused and not having that. Like I tell my students, I teach this Max class at the moment, and when we open up a blank slate, it's like a blank slate of terrifying freedom, right? You can kind of do anything. And I think what was nice, especially starting with the modular stuff and really learning one module at a time, is that there's constraints. You can do a lot of things with a small amount of gear, and that gear that's sitting in front of you, not only does it kind of invite play and physical interaction, but it also kind of makes you creative in terms of working with what you've got. And so that was interesting for me, because I think when I was programming in Max, my constraints were, I guess, what my knowledge was or what my skills were at that particular time. But I knew that you could do so many things. But it was really nice to kind of get back to basics and learn new skills. So yeah, that's kind of where it went from. And I have done a bit of DIY stuff, but that's very recent and more linked to some of the stuff I've done with Surge. But that having the modular environment being something that constrains action, but also being something that is open and extensible, I guess links to that low-level stuff, but also is very different at the same time.
Okay, because I was wondering, what is the approach of someone who was used to make their own instrument towards, let everything go and just work with somebody else's work, which I think that this is actually what every other musician does, because there is the music instrument manufacturer and the musician. Might be a degree of awareness on what you expect from your instrument. You may have some preferences according to the music you play, but there's very few instrument player who actually bother to tweak their own instrument.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Because this is like a question that I've been asking myself quite a lot recently, especially answering those people that say, why do you have like 10 grams of modular synthesizer when you can do the same thing on a computer? And I'm always like, yeah, you can recreate the same thing on the computer, which is not the same as doing the same thing. It's like when you go to a contemporary art exhibition and the people say, yeah, I can do that. And it's not, you can redo that, but the idea is still somebody else's, So, and there is like something that is so simple and yet so overlooked, which is the fact that on an analog instrument, you're able to tweak two parameters at the same time with both of your hands. And on a computer, this is not possible unless you program an all-purpose controller and then configure your instrument that does not match what you see on the screen. So you have to do like an enormous amount of work just to be able to tweak two knobs at the two parameters at the same time. And then if you want to tweak two other parameters, you have to do that work again. And but yeah, this is like an ongoing research.
Sorry, I might just jump in there because that's super interesting what you're saying. Like I remember being frustrated when wanting to, like this, what you're talking about is this separation between interface and instrument, right? Like, and I guess there can be an argument that the interface is a big part of the instrumentality of something that you're playing with. But in terms of computer music and digital music, there has to be a hard separation between interface and sound generation, right? And that can be super frustrating. I guess when I was working in Max, I was building things that I didn't actually think of as instruments. They were things that I wasn't playing or performing in a way that felt instrumental as I knew it from being a player. But actually I was using my instrument most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time I was using my instrument and I was trying to find ways of having the computer do the heavy lifting and analyze what I was doing, and respond in some kind of semi-intelligent way. Now, there was no machine learning or anything like that, but it was doing recognition of timbre and gesture and automated things. And so I did a lot of thinking about this, that actually the tools that I was building were more like some kind of a composition / improvisation environment rather than an instrument. And so what's interesting about that is that when you move from that way of thinking to sitting down at a modular synthesizer, I think over time now, with experience, the work that I've been doing with the modular synth has come closer to that way of working, this more generative way of working. But initially it was very fresh for me to just have something that I could play with, and some of the stuff that I had been frustrated by with with digital tools, Macs included, but also working with Ableton and stuff, were that I couldn't play my instrument and do that at the same time. So I needed to find a new way of working with the tool. But once I put the saxophone down, there were other options that were open to me, and working in this tactile way with analog synths and modular synth in particular was a really great way of just kind of separating those two practices and then finding later on that they did converge. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, I know.
No, it makes complete sense, because I remember that I saw a video from Anthony Marinelli, the famous worldwide synth player and programmer of LA, where he was interviewing Mark Barton, because Mark Barton sold him the original Moog that was used for Plantasia, and it was highly it went a little bit of viral with that video. So I saw that, and there was an interesting conversation on why he would sell such an iconic instrument. And he was like, well, nowadays I'm doing everything with a computer and I prefer a digital approach. So there was a little bit of a debate, which was far from sterile, on the digital versus analog. And I think that it addressed the crucial difference, because I think that we grew up with a debate, analog versus digital, that focused on the sound quality. And I agree that the digital world have filled a huge gap, and it is now comparable to an analog instrument. So I don't think that that's the point of like just focusing on the sound. But Anthony Marinelli said a very interesting thing, and is that, well, I still think that there is room for analog instrument, for even though they are so limited, because of the interface, because of how you interact with the instrument, and you know that what you feel, what you touch is exactly what you are operating with. Whereas there is still this sort of kind of a diaphragm between you and the real digital instrument. And he says that the digital world has come huge distance sound-wise, but interface-wise, it is still way behind an analog instrument.
Yeah, absolutely. It's super interesting, and I totally agree with that. I mean, I think that you're right, though, that the gap is kind of closing in, but there's still a decision that needs to be made to map one thing to another, right? And that decision that's made is a creative decision, and it's often a really aesthetic decision on the part of the designers. The decision of a designer, for instance, to open up part of that decision making to a user is one of the advantages of digital, that there's this possibility of kind of opening up a framework to say, well, look, it's mapped this way, but it could be mapped a bunch of different ways. But what's really nice, you're right. Like this whole idea of just when you touch that thing, it does that thing, and that's just the way it is. That's how we.
Always that.
It's always that.
It's not gonna change.
Exactly. Yeah, it's always that. And it was actually interesting. I was just reading an article today. It's a chapter from, I can't remember what the book is, but it's a chapter on. It's a research project that Elliot Bates did on modular synthesis and modular synth communities, and it's kind of an organological look at the kind of study of musical instruments and the way that they form in culture and things. And he was kind of interviewing a bunch of people that worked with modular or designers and things, and this term came up a few times, like analogness, the feel of something being analog is kind of just as important for a user who's working with an interface as it actually being analog. And this came up a number of times, that this whole idea of the sound is actually a moot point now, and it's all about interface. And so it's interesting the kinds of decisions that are being made in the design space about this mapping and trying to get as close to that feeling of analogness. But yeah, there's still things, you know, that when you move this particular knob, you know, it's always going to be that. And yeah, fascinating.
I've always had a little bit of troubles using a compressor in my DAW, and I remember the shock that I had when I put my hands on a bunch of analog units in a studio, and I was shocked by how easy it is to operate on that device. And then once I fiddle around with some analog devices, the way I approached my DAW compressors was completely different, and it was like more focused because of, I think, that a certain degree of forgiveness that analog instruments have. So they're a bit more tolerant on the setting that you dial in, especially because the pot, even if you put it in the same way, if you come from the right or from the left, it's not exactly that, but anyway, it does the job. And then you can focus more on you don't have to be. I mean, when I'm working on a computer, which I use also, sometimes I perform with a computer, but I always have the feeling that something is not there. I mean, it's like walking on ice. I need to be very careful every time on what I see, what I watch. I need to be double check everything, double check that everything is mapped properly. And even if you work with a controller or if you work with the mouse, you need to take a look at where the pointer is every time. You cannot like reach a certain point in space with a right amount of approximation and your target is there, like with every other instrument. And so, yeah, and the fact that now analog, there is this way of being analog to analog is a kind of, I mean, it's something that I need to process a little bit. But the focus, the struggle of being, the idea of analogness, I mean, something which is analog to analog, sounds a little bit of a paradox. But I get the point.
Yeah. It does. I mean, I think we've also kind of come full circle with some of these tools. I mean, like there's a company that's built a module that hosts VCV rack emulations.
Oh yeah,
of modules.
I saw that.
You know? and I think, like, as a concept, amazing, and I'm sure it's super flexible for something that's a small case and things like that. But for me, it's just bonkers, this whole concept of going from one to another to one to another. You know, like it does what it does is it acknowledges the advantages of the digital, but then in saying, oh, we actually need to bring this back into the analog, it's also then acknowledging the thing that people want, which is being able to touch and feel and you know, integrate it into something else. Yeah. And I mean, I was thinking that
it's like a postmodern approach to Eora synthesizer.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking when you were talking about compressors as well, and this difference between working in a DAW, there's something about the precision of, you know, I'm bringing the threshold down minus 21.6 or something like that, as an example. It's a dial, but there's also all this feedback which is so detailed and precise that when, you know, I think when you're learning particular tools, there's this like overload of information, visual information that that you feel like you need to attend to, you know, in order to understand how the thing works.
Yeah, I think it's kind of compensating for the lack of actual, like, tactile connection.
Yeah.
This overwhelmingly appealing visual interface.
Yeah. And I think, you know, like I think of one example, like the Ableton stock compressor, right? It's amazing. It you can do great things with it. It has 3 different ways of seeing the compression, right? And so I think of it from my student's eyes, right? Like if I'm teaching a student how to use compression, it's so confusing, so incredibly confusing. And like, I think, you know, you have to go through a particular way of thinking to think, okay, well, look, this is how you would represent it this way. But just like you're talking about getting into a studio and pulling down the threshold on a, you know, SSL bus compressor or something like that, and just listening and just dialing something in until it feels right. There's that hand-eye ear coordination that's happening in the moment, which we're not. I guess we're not. Obviously, you're using your eyes, but we're not. You're looking at the needle, etc. But there's not that kind of detailed look at all the possible ways of representing what you're hearing.
Yeah, because especially going back to what you said about the blank slate of frightening freedom, the precision of digital instruments bears a huge, like a crucial burden, which is that you need to know exactly what you want to do, down to the last digit. Otherwise, it's not going to sound exactly like that. Whereas on analog gear, you may have a vague idea of what you want to do, and then you will find it more or less like fairly quickly and with a reasonable degree of approximation. There is very little room for approximation in the digital world. And I think that this somehow created a false need for absolute precision in music making, in every degree of music making, from classical music, contemporary classical music, where it was like an idea, was like back. I mean, if I think about the scores of Brian Fernie, where everything is like carefully noted down, and then you hear 2 performances and they still sound different. So there is, I mean, I think that with analog gear, you kind of embrace the fact that there will always be some degree of approximation on every musical and every artistic performance. Luckily, I would say.
I also think that there's something, there's something about the sitting down, you know, the blank slate of a modular patch versus a blank slate of a, I don't know, an Ableton session or a Max patch or whatever it is, that, you know, you might know how many Ableton devices are available to you. You might know Max inside out, and you know all of the objects, etc. But there's something about having both the physical haptic thing in front of you, but also just like the territory, if you like, of a system staring you in the face. You can see all the possible starting points. You know, you can just see them all right in front of you, and like most of the patches that I'm most happy with start with like some kind of a what if thing, you know, like I haven't, you know, like just sitting and staring at the instrument without a particular idea today. Or I don't have a particular goal in mind. Like I don't have a performance in 2 days. Or even if I do have a performance tomorrow or in 2 days, just this kind of sitting down and going, okay, well, I need something to start with, and just being able to just pull something out of the air, but it's right in front of you, rather than, you know, like the classic thing that I know a lot of my students do is they just open up the folder full of kick samples and then boom, 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 you know. And then they get the 4 on the floor thing going, or whatever kind of music they're making, right? This thing of like asking a question. The first patch cable goes in, and it's like you're asking a question. What would this do? But it's in front of you. So yeah, I think that's something for me that's like really inspiring about these tools, is that they sit there and kind of infer something, or you can infer something from them by just physically having them in front of you.
Yes, they are physically there in front of you, and most importantly, ready to play. Because this is like the biggest difference. Because even when I have like an electric guitar behind me, and this is not the guitar is not plugged in, and I never play it. because I would have to fetch a cable and connect it and this kind of thing. Whereas on the modular synthesizer, if someone is privileged enough to have it permanently hooked to the speaker system or to the headphone, it's really ready to play. And this is like the most important thing for every instrument. You don't have time to waste to set up your instrument and put yourself in the condition of playing. The instrument should be already there, ready to serve your musical ideas. I've never framed that in those terms, but thanks for introducing this concept.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, no, I think of that too. I mean, I haven't played guitar in ages, but I have a guitar right here on the wall, and it's like the idea was to get it out of storage and just have it sitting next to me, so that if I ever did want to just kind of play around and use an amp simulator or something like that, I would. But ever since I put the hanger there, it's just stayed there.
Yeah, because it's like I get it. It's not ready to be played. I mean, it's not. It doesn't. I mean, it's not like the position of a musical instrument. It's the position of a piece of furniture.
Yeah.
But since you mentioned like the process that sparks that triggers some of your patches, I think that this could be the right moment to edit your patch in and then your patch breakdown.
Sure. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to try and run down this patch as best I can. So it's a lot more kind of dark and atmospheric than I expected, or than I anticipated when I first started here. So what I'm going to do is just kind of trace the genesis of the patch and kind of talk about the various sources, and run through how I've used the modules and stuff like that. So basically what I'll do is I'll turn off the effects and things. The first source really of this patch came about by thinking about pinged filters and how much I love the sound of pinged filters, particularly through wave folders and wave shapers and things. So what I'm doing here is I've got a new module for me, which is the Tokyo Tape Music Center timbre and gate, and the timbre is kind of modeled after the Buchla music easel. And I'm pinging the Surge VCFQ filter and taking the low output and whoops, hang on, and I'm using two combined clocks from Sapel. So I'm taking both of the random clocks going into 3, 2, 1 and combining them and sending them out to the trigger input here of the VCFQ. So that's giving the kind of pinging resonance. I'm also using one of the sample and hold outputs to control the resonance, but also to control the pitch, just not the volt per octave, but coming in the kind of CV input. I'm also using that same clock to clock an Ooster, and this Ooster is on. It's working on a external input. So that's how I've been kind of working with this source. But in terms of the modulation is coming from the Ooster, one of the channels of the Ooster, one of the tracks of the Ooster, and I'm mixing that into a mixer here, a CV mixer, so that I can get different types of modulation. So the modulation that I've got here is directly from Ooster, also from an LFO from Brenzo, so I'm kind of dialing that in. So if there's no modulation, it's just a kind of a pure pinged filter. And this is the timbre circuit with some modulation. But another thing I like to do is feed back the output of a wave folder back into its own CV input, and that can get some kind of gnarly things going. So I've mixed that in here. Give some extra harmonics. Okay, and then I'm also taking one of the outputs of the filter with really low attenuation. So lots of attenuation, so I'm only opening up a little bit, and I'm feeding it back to the input of the filter itself. So what you get then is you get these kind of weird gliding things. If I really open that up, you'll hear that. Super crazy. Bit too much. So I'm just dialing that in a little bit. Okay. So that's what's going on with that. Now the resonance is actually, I'm not using any reverbs here. I'm just using rings and Morphagene. So here's the rings. I've got the nano rings, which is the DIY version of rings, set to string model with its pitch and its shape all the way down, and it's dampening right off so it continues forever. And I'm just modulating the position, which with an LFO or a slewed random voltage here, which is giving this kind of change in pitch and timbre. So I thought that was a nice way to create resonance that wasn't exactly reverb. Okay, cool. And the second form of resonance is actually the Morphagene, and I'm using the Morphagene as a live sampler, not sampling itself, but just sampling outside. There's a mode you can set in there. And I've got a gate pattern, which just like every now and again will choose a gate to either turn on recording, so turn on sampling, or turn off sampling. And I'm clocking it so that it's kind of going through. I've got it the octave up. And what it's actually sampling is not this pinged filter, but it's sampling the output of rings. So one resonance source is sampling the output of another resonance source, which I think is kind of cool, and another form of feedback. Okay, so I might move on from that source. The next one is a really knotted, quite complex source using Brenso. And I'm taking this original VCF-Q pinged filter and kind of using that to modulate Brenso in some interesting ways. So let's just have a listen to it first. I've got no, maybe a little bit of delay on it, but I've got no other effects. Okay, so as you can hear, it's kind of gnarly. Lots of stuff going on. So let me just explain what's happening. Essentially what I've got here is I've got the yellow oscillator. I'm taking the final output right the way down. I'm using one of these Sapel sample and holds to change its pitch. But then everything else is really the modulation. So first what I've got is I've got some blue noise going into the wave folder modulation. And that's being opened up every now and again by the same slewed random voltage that I was mentioning before. Its exponential FM is actually itself, so it's FMing itself, and the FM index for both linear and exponential FM is coming from the same sequence that's changing the timbre on the pinged filter, and then the linear FM is actually the output of the Morphagene that's modulating Brenso. Okay, so again, another form of feedback. So Morphagene comes from the rings comes from the pinged wave folded filter, and now it's modulating this. Okay. Then I've actually got a direct output from the filter that is synchronizing this oscillator as well. So when it pings, it tries to, the Brenso tries to catch up and synchronize to that oscillator, which is giving it some, I guess, percussive and timbral relationship to the original. And then I've also got another output, I'm trying to remember where this comes from, another output of the filter, which is acting as a ring modulated source for this, and I'm opening that up every now and again. So what's interesting about that is that when the ring modulation index is really high, you don't hear it that much, but if I close it off, it becomes much more active. So I kind of have it dialed in so that it comes in every now and again. And then yeah, I've got some resonance on that too. So if we hear those two sources together, so that's being panned around as well, and I'm using the second track of the Ooster with everything slewed and on bipolar mode to get some panning on this source. Bring in the rings, the Morphagene again. Now what I've also got is I've got that Brenso that is being sent back to the timbral modulation of the wave folder. So now I've introduced you to that source. What I can do is I can open up that. You can hear how that then affects the original ping. It's super gnarly. Okay, and then the final source, I'll just bring all this down. The final source is taking the Brenso output. I'm trying to remember which input it is. Yep, so it's coming directly out of this Brenso crazy output in the CGM channel. And I'm sending that into a Belgrade dual peak filter. That's being modulated by one of the sample and holds from the Sapel. Oh, I should say as well, in the Sapel random clocks and the clocks, I'm feeding one of the clocks. I think I'm feeding the green one to the yellow one, which means that the sample and hold modulation follows both clocks, because I am using them to ping it. So one of those clocks is changing the frequency of this filter, but also I'm setting the filter's output back to its span control, so that's getting even more kind of gnarliness going on. And I'm using one of the Felicity channels to open and close an LPG here. So I've got this kind of flittering thing, which is also panned. I might open up this ring modulator so you can hear it. So I've got two forms of dynamic modulation. There's this Felicity, which is doing the flittery stuff. And then I've got a maths channel, which is opening up the actual VCA in the mixer here, which means that I can open up, so it's a form of submixing of CV modulation. So I can have these gestures, which have got their own dynamic variation coming in and out. So if I bring it all together, put some delay on that one maybe. Yeah, so that's it. Kind of crazy, knotted, fed back, dark, kind of resonant patch. It's been really great kind of working with different forms of feedback, and also just getting really deep into modulation of the Brenso. Like if it was that sound itself, it might be a bit too crazy, but because it colors the original sound, I think it's a really nice addition to the sound world.
So there are a few elements that I would like to expand on your patch, which are the idea of feedback patching, the use of clocks, like multiple clocks summed together, and also some module-specific questions, like how you used the USTA sequencer in more detail, and the use of Brenso's sync input. And so feel free to start where you prefer.
Yeah, sure. Look, thanks for the opportunity to put together a patch for this. It was really interesting. I mean, this particular patch kind of, I guess, relied on resonances and things more than I usually would. So it was great to be able to do that patch breakdown to kind of make clear the kind of complexity and things that is going on, both in terms of CV generation, but also in terms of sound generation. So maybe just to kind of start with the USTA and clocking. I mean, almost exclusively I use the USTA with an external clock. And the reason for that is that even if I do start with a regular clock with things that I do, there's always the chance that I'm going to start messing with the clock in terms of accelerandi and decelerandi. Like that's just something that I rallentando. That's something that I do a lot with timing. So using the USTA with an external clock actually makes a lot of sense to me. I had been kind of like every now and again I jump into the manual to remind myself of certain things that modules can do. And the Sapel, I always keep asking myself, like, okay, so when you flick that switch in either the yellow or the green clock, what's it actually doing? So I read that it's feeding one clock to another, and that affects the way that the sample and hold works on each side of it. So say, for instance, you're working with the yellow outputs and you flick it to also receive the green clock. The sample and hold outputs are a combination of those two clocks, but the clock outputs themselves say the same. And that was what my understanding was. And that was kind of interesting to me because I thought, well, What I actually would really like is to have these clocks that were randomized using the, like the probable, rate of change, but have them combined in a way that I could get these this ebb and flow and this unpredictability that was even more unpredictable, I guess, than the clocks. But having said that, in this particular patch, it was quite open and slow. It wasn't chaotic in terms of the way the clocks were working. There was a lot of space between certain events. So it's the first time I've actually ever done that, where I've used 3-2-1 to combine two clocks. And I know that they're, like if you've got two clocks that come in close enough together, then really you're just going to send out one clock. But that didn't, like the technical specifics didn't bother me too much. But it was just a great way of being able to get a sequencer going based off two clocks that were related in some way, especially seeing as I was pinging a filter and that filter was being modulated using this combined clock. I thought that was kind of a nice way of doing things. So that the way I was using Ooster in that way was kind of fun, and I wasn't using Ooster as a pitch output. I was really just using it as timbre, that first track. And then I had another track that was being used for panning, and that was probably the first time I've done that as well. Remembering that you can actually do the the green and the blue variation, so the randomness, and have them based off a bipolar slewed output rather than a unipolar. And I thought, well, sometimes I'm looking around in my system for something that's bipolar to get some decent panning going. And although Sepel's amazing, I know that it's unipolar. All of the outputs are unipolar. So often I'm going for other sample and hold things that have a true bipolar output. And I know that Bagai does that now with the bipolar stuff. So that's how I was using Ooster mainly. There was also some clocks in there. Sorry, some gate outputs that I was using for the Morphagene, but it was at a kind of a different rate, different speed to the original sequence. So I often like to just get things in a generative patch like this, get things kind of moving, and then get a sense of what the density is, and then start working on other things. And then I tweak the density. So like, does it need to move faster? Does it need to be more active or less active? And hope that answers your question.
Yeah, especially the sparseness of the events that you mentioned. I mean, it makes the randomness less prominent, and especially creates a space for the reverb without reverb that you put on, which was a very fascinating technique. That was, I really enjoyed that. I think that it adds a very interesting and ear-catching feature to the patch without being too much of a cliche, because it's very easy to have like a beautiful sound with a reverb. It basically makes everything sounding good. But the way you achieved it was very, not obvious at all.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. No, I like using Morphagene in that way, this kind of granular sampling in a way that that has, especially when it's not going all the time, it's something that's just kind of grabbing things every now and again, and in a way it kind of, so much of the stuff that I do is from low level events to moving from low level events to high level processes, right? And so like something like these slow random clocks, then actually generating some kind of a harmonic layer, rather than thinking harmony and then some kind of slow harmonic movement that then gets filled in with melody. It's the other way. It's the other way around. Like this idea of everything being able to be clocked down in order to generate larger structures. And I think that's often the way I think about time in a modular patch is starting first from something that can generate many events, and then I find my way back. And the reverb and the use of Morphagene in that way is a way of just being able to capture onto things and then extend, which in a way creates some kind of a harmonic layer, which is related to something that's happened a few events ago, if you know what I mean.
Because you use the setting where it samples only the input signal. So even if it is like fully clockwise, so you hear only the wet sound, you don't do, basically it doesn't do sound on sound.
That's right. It doesn't do sound on sound. And I found that I pretty much exclusively use Morphagene in that way, because it has an amazing sound when it does that. If it's pitched up a little bit, then we'll pitch up and up and up and up and up and up, that kind of thing. But that in my mind has a pretty cliche sound to it. Like it after a while you recognize that direction and that texture. So I tend to, like, if I want to have that flexibility of moving the pitch of the Morphagene without it then cascading up or down. I just keep it always as a direct line in sampler.
Yeah, I should try to use that mode because I always tend to rely on the cliche.
I mean, it's a great. I actually have a Meris pedal, the LVX modular delay pedal, which is amazing, and it has a lot of these beautiful modes where you have these kind of stacked fifths that then feed back. Well, I mean, you can patch it any way you want, but there's a particular preset that I was like, oh, I know that sound, and it's this kind of like, things just sample each other until it goes up into the ether, and almost shepherd tony.
Yeah.
But not.
So this basically brings in the idea of like feedback patching or generative patching, as you said, and so there is the use of random voltage output that influence them. So there is like a degree of feedback patching on the instruction level, which is, I would say, more or less the same as saying generative patching, where the machine is programming itself. But there is also audio feedback, especially what you did with the wave folders. And I mean, is it? I am always fascinated by feedback patching, and I also remember that one of your first influences was use of feedback for saxophone that you heard in a performance. So I would I was just wondering if this is still a field of research for you, the idea of feedback patching and generative patching, or
it definitely is. And I think that I mean, we were talking before in terms of software, this kind of almost needless specificity or needless precision, right? And I think that you can, like this. It's something that you hear a lot of people say with a modular system. You can never patch the same thing twice, right? Like you might write down the patch exactly and you put things together and it's never the same twice. But you can still patch in a really deterministic way, in a way that you have a particular goal and you know the sound that you're after and you go for that. You set the sequence to do exactly the pitches that you want, and you set the modulations doing exactly what you want. Little spice of randomness to get things interesting, but like within a particular framework, and that it's really context dependent, genre dependent, etc. But for me, what I really like in all music as a performer and as a listener is when I am completely surprised and bamboozled by something that's going on within limits. So like audio feedback is a fascinating thing for me, and it can tip right into noise music very, very quickly. And I find that in some of the work that I do, I try to kind of tame things so that it's controllable in a way. But I absolutely love this weird space where I'm kind of piloting or setting up a process that I have some idea of some kind of high level specifics of what it's going to do, when it's going to do something, maybe how loud or whatever. But the internal specifics, I have no idea. And yes, you can grab a random source to do that. But the interesting thing about random sources is that under the hood, there's a bunch of stuff, you know, the sampling of thermal noise or working with probability or whatever it is that I'm not exactly aware of what it's doing. What I really like is to be able to patch my own randomness in a way that has some kind of determinism to it. Like a feedback patch can be super unpredictable and chaotic, but it's actually really deterministic as well. You decide that this thing influences this thing, and it will then influence that thing, which influences that thing. And the only thing that makes it unpredictable to us is that it's gone past our possibility of understanding what's happening. And I love getting to that point, programming something, and that's what, you know, my software derivations that I was talking about that I did for my PhD, that's what that was about for me, is programming something that has enough complexity from really deterministic decisions, that it tips over that point of surprise for me, and then I'm happy. As soon as I know too much about how it's doing something, I want to prod it into something that I don't understand and get inspired by it, right? So the feedback patching in this particular patch, I kept it dialed low in terms of the waveform, the wave shaping feedback, but it can go super, super wild. What I liked about it is that every time it would kind of come back with a new pitch or a new timbral variation, it would glide in an unpredictable way, or I might blurt out a sound in a way that I didn't expect it to. And I love that kind of thing. And then coupling that in the live performances that I do, I often do a lot of feedback using the Surge triple wave shaper, which can kind of squeal and do some interesting chirpy type sounds, but also really gnarly, distorted feedback. And I like using that in a very kind of performative way where I'll turn it on and off. And when I turn it on and off, I don't know exactly what sound's going to come out, but there's a gestural intent to it. But the sound itself is kind of unpredictable. And in an improvised setting with myself or with others, and I perform a lot with Sonia Hollowell, who's a vocalist, an improvising vocalist, those kind of ambiguities between am I controlling it or is it giving me ideas are just so... they're really generative for creativity. So yeah, in a generative patch like this, in inverted commas, I think it's really amazing to kind of use feedback to push sounds in directions that you're not. So you can have unpredictability, but also piloting them can be really fun because you have control, but you don't have control over everything. Yeah. So the really long-winded answer. It's a interesting topic to me.
Yeah, because you push them into unpredictable directions, but at the same time you know exactly the map in which they're moving. You just don't know the direction they're gonna take, but at least you have limited the exploration range. That's would say
exactly. Yeah. Same kind of thing with control voltage feedback, but I mean, the way that I used Brenso in this one was very unusual for me. So there was some...
So let's talk about that.
Yeah. So Brenso in this, so often the way that I will build a patch like this where I've got a few voices is I will often start a second voice by finding some untapped thing from the first voice and then using that to color the first voice, or maybe it will become its own thing. But I like to find relationships between sounds first, and so that's kind of where the Brenso thing came in, because I started by thinking, okay, well look, I need some kind of other sound, and I immediately grabbed an output from the filter and thought, well, how can I FM Brenso so that it sounds kind of similar. I know that it's not going to be a static tone like you would if you grab the green into the yellow or some other source, but some kind of really active source as FM. What's that going to sound like? And so I started doing that and kind of dialed things in. and then also added some kind of RM from the same filter. It was kind of a really weird sense of kind of choking that happened with the RM patch. So like I have the output of the, I mean, I would have said it in the patch breakdown, but I'm trying to remember now. I had the output of the wave folder from the Tokyo wave folder, FMing something, and then I had a direct output from the filter synchronizing the Brenso. So it's already kind of tracking the pitches of the original.
Yeah, there was also the Morphagene output doing some degree of FM. I think it was in the linear. Probably,
yeah. So the Morphagene output, which is the that kind of static granular thing, was also a form of FM, but there was the index of the FM was rising and falling with the same CV that was controlling the timbre. So it wasn't always the FM itself wasn't always audible. But the sync was constantly there, and the RM was also being kind of opened and closed. But the interesting thing about the RM, for some reason, it was the combination of the sync coming from the filter and also the RM coming from the filter, that if I really opened up the RM, the sound would almost choke and just not be audible. So
you use the sync input on the yellow oscillator, right?
Yes, that's right. I use the sync input on the yellow oscillator.
And how did you set the jumper on the back? Is it like flip sync or?
Oh, I don't know about that. Can you tell me about that?
Oh yeah. Because it's like the green oscillator. The green oscillator has a 3-position switch for syncing, which is off, flip, and lock. I think they're named this way. In this, and I don't remember the order, but the 2 options are flip sync, where basically is like kind of hard sync, but for triangle core oscillators. So with every impulse, every raising edge of the master oscillator will synchronize the other one. But instead of resetting and creating a spike as in sawtooth core oscillator, it just inverts the direction of the core. So if the triangle is going down, it will go up, and if it is going up, it will go down. And it gives a smoother texture than hard sync. But you can do like the sync sweep with that behavior.
Yeah.
Whereas on lock sync, basically you have the synchronized oscillator whose logic states, like the threshold that invert the cycle, the voltage going up and down, are slightly moved up and down according to the fluctuations of the other oscillator. And this is a way to preserve a very simple way to preserve the direction and to have them locked in the same, more or less in the same phase. It's a pretty rudimentary technique. I think it's still the same of the 259, I would say.
Right.
And so the sync input on the yellow oscillator can work in both ways according to the jumper setting on the back.
Well, I've never touched that jumper because I didn't know it was there. So whatever is the default is what I was using. Okay, what would be the default? Would it be the flipped?
Probably lock.
Lock,
maybe.
Okay, yeah.
If it gets noisy, it's lock.
Okay, cool.
You can verify it just by simply putting like a very low square wave. But the cool thing is that probably it was choking because, there was a lot of modulations going on. But
yeah,
that input is designed with a waveform, like with steep wave fronts, and for example, like a square wave is the ideal waveform to obtain the sync effect. But I mean, this is not the same as saying that it is only accept that.
Exactly,
I mean, you can throw in whatever sound you want and see what happens. So I guess that this is what happened.
And this is what happened. Yeah, and I think that's interesting because because there would have been some with the high resonance with that filter, there would have been some pitches that rang on, and so it would have kind of locked on nicely, but others kind of started and then would have stopped. You know, so, and depending on whether or not I was getting that from the wave-folded output versus the actual filter itself, and I'll have to double check my patch to remember that. But yeah, so there was that sync, but it was interesting that the index dial of the RM, the red RM, was the thing that if I put that right the way down, you would hear this beautiful sync sound. It would be very continuous. But as I opened that right up, because the RM was also coming from the same place, I think, or a similar place, that's when things started to choke. So it would have been this like interesting interaction between the sync and the thing that was RMing it being similar to the sync, that it was, you know, starting to close off. But I love that kind of sound, that kind of unpredictable sound where things do, you know, like you think you've got something that is quite continuous and sustained, but then it starts to break down or glitch. And I think I said in the patch breakdown as well, like if I was starting from that tone and that tone being mainly the main sound, it would have probably been a bit too crazy. But when you place it with the other one and the resonance, it's a color, which was kind of interesting. And it kind of articulated with the pinged source, which was kind of fun to play with. But yeah, no, the Brenso, you can get so deep with the modulation. I mean, there was also, I think the first time that I'd done used noise as a modulation source for anything really, but using noise as a modulation source for the wave folder was interesting. And having that also dynamically open and close, so it wasn't constantly there, you know, using the index for that with an envelope and things, coupled with all this other movement. Yeah, really, really fun.
I would say that the weirdest and less obvious uses for the Brenso oscillator come from Australian musicians, since also Sam Saker used his Brenso in a very unorthodox way, so to speak, because he tuned like the oscillator below audio rate and used noise into the wavefolder modulation to have some texture elements, like some kind of gritty sound that could bring in and out. So that is, I mean, it's fun as manufacturers, and it's really something we've been grateful for, to see how many ways the instruments we design can take way beyond our expectations, and seeing that there is still much to uncover in an instrument that is almost more than 4 years old, the Brenso, which is in today's terms is like an age, is really heartwarming.
Oh, I mean, it's such a deep module. You know, I mean, like all of the Frap Tools modules are so densely packed, and they can do so many things. And I think that's why I've gravitated towards them. And the Brenso in particular is just one of these things that you think you know a complex oscillator, or you think you know a random source, or you think you know a dual, you know, envelope generator. But there's ways that you guys have created these things to have that extensibility, openness, and they kind of invite play. I think really, you know, especially the Brenso having that having the separation between the white kind of wave folded section, and then forgetting that and just thinking in a pretty classic, almost 258 way, in terms of having two playing against each other. Sometimes I just forget the wave folded part and just play in that more kind of classic way of using a complex oscillator. But yeah, no, it's been fantastic and super fun.
Awesome. And since we are talking about modules, for our modules, I think that this could be the time for the final question that I always ask to our guests, which is that if you could pick and decide what our upcoming module would be, what could it be and why?
Yeah. Yeah, big question. I've heard you ask this to a few people on the podcast, and I've thought about, I mean, there's so many things in the range that Frap Tools does, that do things in fascinating ways based off things that we kind of are aware of that we already know. But one thing that was quite instrumental for me in my system is moving away from one contained mixer into having the CGM system. So having the quad stereo channel, I've got two of the old school mono channels, which are great fun to use.
Yeah.
I've got the Master One. But something that's great about that is how I use them in a really tactile way when I'm performing. I mean, you wouldn't have seen it in the patch that I put up for this, but there's a sense of tactility in terms of the way that things work. I have thought I would love some kind of a controller, I guess, because Uster is like the hub, I guess, the brains, the musical hub of sequencing in a system like this. And for me, it feels like the CGM system is a way of sculpting things. But some kind of touch controller or physical input device would be amazing. So, whether or not it's old school bookless style force sensitive resistors or something that borrows from the incredible depth of the digital side of things in terms of Usta, in terms of physical control. I think that would be amazing. A Frap designed physical input device that could also supplement or complement something like the depth of the Usta would be amazing. I heard Matt mentioning he wants two big knobs and I thought, I'm going to be too similar to Matt in terms of but yeah, I thought that was also a really great idea in terms of being able to spit out CV everywhere. But I love the idea of I play very physically when I do, when I'm not just making generative patches, and having something physical in front of me would be amazing. So I don't know if that's on the cards, but that I'll put my vote in.
That's a huge challenge, a huge task to undertake. Also, Isabella Forciniti expressed her desire for some kind of physical controllers, also going a bit further and talk about tactile thing, like something you can squeeze or like sponges kind of thing.
Right.
Which, I mean, if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense in the context of such a physical approach as the modular synthesizer.
Yeah,
but this is putting a bit of a pressure on us to have this kind of task.
Yeah, you've got your wish list growing by the day, I guess.
But the wish list for like controllers is piling up, because also I myself, I'm finding a bit of I had a period where I tried some controller. I already said that in previous episodes, and I became a little bit frustrated by the fact that I still had to configure them to the modular synthesizer, and basically it was like creating macros for the modular synth. So probably it wasn't, I did not approach controller with a proper mindset back then. So maybe I need
It's a challenge though, isn't it? I mean, like I have a Buchla 200E system, very lucky, bought through my work at the Conservatorium and everything. And that touch surface is incredible. Like it's the 223E. I'm not sure exactly, but it's got a long name. But it's an absolute pain in the ass to program. And you have to be very intentional about what you want to be doing if you want to use that device. And so, and it goes back to what we were saying before, is this idea of like just getting and wanting something in front of you to touch and to move, not having to make some kind of mapping decision first. So that's I can see it's a huge challenge.
I just want to, right now, my ideal controller would be just, I would say, a bunch of faders and a bunch of buttons. And the buttons create gates, and the fader create control voltages, and that's it.
And that's it. Yeah,
I could be happy with that.
Yeah.
I mean, just being able to create gates with buttons.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I have a button control, like it's a 4 HP thing from Instro, which is I can't even remember what it's called now. It's usually a beautiful Gaelic name, and I can't remember the name of it. Mm-hmm. But it's basically a 2-channel switch. But if you don't have anything connected to it, pushing the button down will just send out whatever voltage you've dialed in. And so I often use that just as gates. You can have it as a toggle or toggle on off, or just as a one shot kind of thing. And that as performative control is amazing. Just to have something that just you when you hit it, it does a thing. It's very analog, and same with I've got a little fader, which is just a thing on the left, which I used in this patch actually as a just to dial in the feedback at the very left of my case, and often just having just those little controllers that will always do the same thing are great. And I know other quite physical modular synthesists. Someone like Richard Scott, for instance, has two of these kind of light touchpad things on either side of his case, and often we'll use the ribbon controller, the Doepfer ribbon controller, and just having these kinds of things that are quite gestural, placed at good points in your case is fun. But yeah, buttons, faders, can't go wrong.
I mean, I would be curious to try Trautonium, because that feels like something very interesting to play and to control, having the levers and the metal wire. But I mean, it is also famous for being very hard to keep up. I mean, also Doepfer used the ribbon. Doepfer? I think that they went on to clone every component of the Mixture Trautonium by Oscar Sala, except for the controller.
Okay.
Because if you go on Doepfer's side, they said even Oscar Sala had to do some maintenance like every concert he played, because it was he basically was like, you cannot manufacture the exact controller without, and at the same time, giving 2 years warranty. It's not possible. It's got to break within the warranty.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Well, that would be faithful to the instrument itself if it did.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, that'd be fun. I love seeing those old videos of him playing the Mixture Trautonium. Amazing.
Yeah, I saw a live concert by Peter Pichler with a friend of mine, a soprano, Giulia Zaniboni, and they played like this primitive electronic composition, like from In the Myth, or those like classical composers that started working for electronic instruments, and treated them like much like orchestral.
It's interesting. Like looking back and seeing some of the earliest works that were written for the Trautonium. Like when Hindemith's name came up, I was like, well, of course it was Hindemith. Hindemith wrote something for every single instrument. He had to write a solo piece for every single instrument. So it's like, there's a new instrument I'm gonna write, and I think it was. He might have wrote a few, but it was a piece for Trautonium and piano, which is just like he's always writing his sonatas, so wasn't surprised. But yeah, it's an incredible instrument, amazing, and like way ahead of its time as well.
Yeah, I think that we covered a lot of interesting topics today, so I would say that we can cap it here for today's episode. I'm gonna add that in this new series of podcast, I won't be performing a patch inspired by our guest patch, but if you who are listening wanna hear that, just let me know in the comments, and I may record them in a separate series of videos. And so I would like to thank you again, Ben, for staying with us today. It's been an amazing journey.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to chat. Appreciate it. And well done on the podcast. I love listening to it and watching the videos and patch breakdowns and everything. Appreciate everything you guys do.